Hello， 大家好，我係 Ken。咁而家就Ken Berry 嘅翻譯嘅第2集。咁呢一集咧係講啲乜嘢咧？就主要咧就講血栓嘅形成嘅特點啊。咁按照研究所得咧，其實血栓嘅形成咧喺人體裏邊咧有幾樣特點嘅。呢一批人咧通常都係高血糖、高血壓同埋高壓力嘅情況下咧，係特別容易形成血栓嘅。咁其實呢一樣嘢咧，佢哋喺個即係 Q&A 裏邊都有講咧。其實呢個係人類進化之中嘅生理反應嚟嘅。咁因為以前古代嘅人咧就要受野外嘅威脅啦，各種唔同嘅威脅，咁要逃亡或者要打獵。咁咧喺呢種情況下咧，佢哋嘅腎上腺素咧就會上升嘅。咁隨時要逃跑或者受攻擊，所以佢哋嘅生理特徵咧就係血糖係會提高，咁跟住個血壓會提高，跟住腎上腺亦都會提高。咁點解會提高咁多樣嘢咧？咁其實主要就係當個身體受到呢種心理同埋外在嘅環境影響嗰陣時咧，佢就會有一個反應，就係凝血蛋白咧就會喺體內咧係會增加嘅。咁點解會增加咧？其實最主要就喺逃亡或者喺打鬥嘅過程裏邊咧，係可能會出血受傷。咁凝血蛋白咧就幫你喺個逃跑或者喺個打鬥嘅裏邊嗰陣時咧，就幫你係好短嘅時間做一個止血。咁所以就如果喺現代人嚟講，因為就冇好似古代人咁樣，咁就容易形成血栓。咁因為現代人咧主要都係飲食問題又引致嗰個血糖上升，咁同埋高血壓啦。咁外在嘅壓力就係工作壓力，或者你本身嗰個人嘅脾氣咧喐啲就即係起晒槓嗰啲咧，就特別容易咧就有心臟病或者血栓。血栓同心臟病咧係息息相關。去到呢一集嘅尾段咧，佢哋亦都講到咧就係粟米油。咁喺好多嘅研究論文裏邊都講咗，其實食用粟米油咧的而且確可以降低嗰個膽固醇嘅。咁但係咧喺個研究出嚟嘅結果咧，佢形成心臟病嗰個比率咧亦都會提升嘅。用粟米油做一個主食咧，唔係一個好好嘅選擇嚟嘅。咁因為好多嘅論文已經講咗粟米油咧係引致高風險心臟病嘅其中一個唔係咁好嘅食用油嚟嘅。咁有興趣嘅朋友就睇落去，我會將啲相關嘅論文咧就喺個 description 嗰度咧就會 post 出嚟。有興趣嘅朋友咧就可以去睇一睇。好，就唔阻大家去片。
My last LDL was 250. Just for reference, if anybody thinks I'm sitting over here with an LDL of 80, telling you guys it's okay to have a high LDL, my LDL is 250, and I'm not worried about it at all.
Yeah, that's extremely high. My LDL is 200. My cholesterol is 300. You know, you just never know when it could happen. But I'm not concerned about it.
Yes, nor am I.
And this is where we get to her question. The answer to the question is there is something so much more important than cholesterol when it comes to development of heart disease. And there are just so many papers on this that I've got just a couple of slides to illustrate this. And we have published papers on this topic. These, again, are people with extremely high cholesterol. I mean, look at how the total cholesterol is over 350. Their LDL is about 275, right up there with you, Ken. And so at this point, they're not on medication lowering their cholesterol. And you've got one population that is diagnosed with CHD, coronary heart disease. Another population does not have coronary heart disease. And look at, there's no difference in either the TC, total cholesterol, or their LDL levels. What matters here is a subset of people with FH have this additional genetic anomaly, which is called having a certain kind of gene, okay, for a clotting factor called prothrombin. So this is a protein that when it gets activated, causes our platelets to stick together and causes clots. And so you find in not only in the people with FH, but in the general population, if these people happen to have this gene that activates prothrombin, which causes platelets to stick together spontaneously, well, then you're a heck of a lot more likely than to have a heart attack. And that's this on the right, in which you're more than twice as likely to have a heart attack compared to people who don't have this genetic anomaly. So this is what people with FH and people in general need to be concerned about, which is excessive clotting, called hypercoagulation.
Yes, and the coagulation cascade. Let me throw this up. This is the coagulation cascade. It is exquisitely. This is dumbed down by a factor of probably 100. Okay, every single step in this cascade. This is all the things that have to happen for you to make a clot, either an appropriate clot or an inappropriate clot. And if anything at all is wrong with this cascade, you're going to form clots more easily, or you'll be a free bleeder. And down at the bottom, you can see prothrombin that Dr. Diamond was talking about. Each one of these steps has at least one, if not more, accelerator pedals that will speed up that step, and one or more brake pedals that will slow that step down. And so if you have a defect in prothrombin that causes it to be on the accelerator, you're going to be much more likely to form an inappropriate clot. And that's what he's talking about. So when you have familial hypercholesterolemia, sure, you have high total cholesterol. That's not the problem, or at least we can say it's probably not the problem. The problem is probably right here on this slide. That's what's causing the increased risk of heart attacks.
That's fantastic that you've included this slide, Ken. And if you go sort of factor VIII to the left in blue, down to prothrombin, down to fibrinogen, those three components are very much associated with heart disease. If people are making too much of that, it's clearly associated with heart disease. Now, what is it? So understand one thing. Just having factor VIII or prothrombin or fibrinogen does not cause a heart attack.
Correct.
What causes clots is activation of this pathway. And what activates the pathway? Stress, hypertension, and high blood sugar. That activates this pathway because now the body interprets stress to meaning that you're under attack, so it's preparing for a hemorrhage. What does it want to do? It wants to make the blood clot, so you'll survive a hemorrhage. So understand something. There are triggers that will make this clotting pathway become activated. And this is something people can control. Even if you have the genetic anomaly, you can control whether or not the clotting pathway gets activated by keeping your blood sugar low, controlling your blood pressure, okay, and also basically controlling stress. And it's really something to keep in mind. This is all under your control. It's not inevitable.
Absolutely. I totally agree. All right, back to the slides. Next slide.
And this is just another one. And I want to show you an ancient paper here because this is before there were statins. And so you had people with extremely high cholesterol, uncontrolled, weren't able to have statins at the time. This paper going back people in the 1970s and 80s. And so again, you've got people with extremely high cholesterol, same thing. And they're specifically measuring those two factors that you showed in the previous slide, fibrinogen and factor VIII. And the ones that have the heart disease are the ones that have more fibrinogen and factor VIII. And so under normal conditions, again, you got more fibrinogen, more factor VIII, you get the high blood sugar, high blood pressure, and overall more stress. And that's what activates these proteins. And that's the way to think about it, both stress and anger. When we feel those two emotions, we literally have clots passing through our arteries. And this is in the absence of being wounded. And that is why it contributes then both to heart disease as well as ischemic strokes, because we produce these clots that then block our arteries. And again, this is something we can control.
And I think it's important to talk about the evolutionary reason why. If you're in a stressful situation, it's your default is to be ready to make clots. That's because in our past, if you were in a situation that was spiking your cortisol and your adrenaline, then you were in a fight or flight situation, and you were very likely to be wounded. And so the coagulation cascade was ramping up, getting ready, because you're probably going to get bitten or stabbed or pushed off the bluff. and you need to be able to form a clot quickly to protect your life. And so there's an evolutionary reason for that. It's not pathology, it's physiology.
Right.
But when we're living in an artificial environment like modern society, where your life is sometimes just a pressure cooker of constant stress and then also constant carbohydrates, then you're basically keeping this pathway overactivated at all times and just ready to make a clot at a moment's notice.
It's a great perspective when we look at the evolutionary relevance of this, because realize if we're under physical attack, we not only have this sense of stress and fear, our body is preparing us to be able to respond to it. So what happens? Blood sugar spikes, blood pressure spikes. This helps us to either attack or to run. And so that's what also triggers the clotting, which prepares us to be wounded. Our immune system also gets ramped up, which is why we have autoimmune diseases, because of constant stress. So if you look at it from that perspective, I think it helps people to understand we need to keep our blood sugar, blood pressure low, but we also need to control that stress. I always like to think, is it worth really getting angry or stressed to potentially make those blood clots, which contribute to an early demise?
Yeah, it's an excellent question that we should all ask ourselves. I totally agree.
Now, this is another one related to, again, the blood clotting. You know, there's so much science out there that you don't get in medical school. You don't get from the American Heart Association. This is some of the science that I want to give you. This is really old studies that have shown that if your blood is thicker, you are more likely to have a stroke, more likely to have a heart attack. And what thickens the blood? The activated clotting factors. So in this case, it's fibrinogen. We have fibrinogen in our blood, and more activated fibrinogen makes our blood thicker. Now, what's beautiful about this study is that they were actually able to filter out fibrinogen versus the cholesterol. And when they filtered out the fibrinogen from these people, the blood is less viscous. That's the red bar going down. It's basically thinner. This is without taking a drug. Okay, this is reducing the fibrinogen. The blood is thinner. Okay, less likely to clot. Now, when you reduce the LDL, there's no significant difference in the viscosity, the thickness of the blood. So this is another measure that tells us that it's the clotting factors that are either directly or indirectly related to our risk for heart disease.
Yes, I totally agree.
And this isn't just something that I talk to people on podcasts about and present in conferences. I've had the great pleasure to work with some outstanding MDs. So Ufi Ravenskov, Michelle DeLaudril, who's a cardiologist, Malcolm Kendrick, who's got some great books on the topic, which, by the way, I love your book too as well, Ken.
Thank you.
Great books on the topic. You're welcome. We published this in a medical journal. So what I'm telling you about now is available in this medical paper. We also published one just about a year ago. We reviewed the literature on people with high cholesterol. And when you measure both the cholesterol and the clotting factors, what you find is the clotting factors are so much better at telling you who has heart disease and who doesn't. And the LDL turns out to be irrelevant. And this is in one of the papers we published on this.
So if a doctor's truly interested in following the science and using what the science shows us to prevent heart attacks in their patients, they should be checking coagulation factors much more often than they check LDL cholesterol.
You know, what is a shame is that, first of all, they don't do that.
I know.
They will put people on medication. Certainly people, if they've had a heart attack, they're put on blood thinners or put on aspirin and other medication. But they're not actually assessing what caused the heart attack. And so if you have a person, I actually know someone who was relatively young and had a heart attack and actually had relatively low cholesterol. And despite that, I'm certain the physicians, the doctors are going to want to put him on a statin. What they really should do, and I've urged him to do, is that he should do a genetic test to see if he's got a genetic anomaly, have a test to assess whether he's got elevated fibrinogen and prothrombin. If so, then potentially you need to be on blood thinners, need to be very careful about keeping your blood pressure and blood sugar low, but there's no reason to lower your cholesterol. And I think the really scholarly doctors who truly care about their patients should be aware that of these different factors that increase risk for heart disease, specifically the clotting factors.
I totally agree, doctor.
And again, you know, I'm emphasizing familial hypercholesterolemia, and it is, I have to say, it is relatively rare. Only about 1 in 200 to 300 people have this anomaly. But what I'm talking about is relevant to everyone. And so that's why I have this slide, because I don't want people to think I'm only talking about FH. In this slide, you're looking at the general population. So you're not looking at any specific population. And what you're seeing is the relation between fibrinogen and both coronary heart disease, that's having a heart attack, as well as having a stroke. And in both cases, what you find is the people who have higher fibrinogen, independent of their age, are more likely than to have a heart attack or stroke. And cholesterol can't compare to this as far as predicting who will have either one of these. So this is why I'm emphasizing we absolutely need clotting factors. You know, without it, we would die under normal conditions. But that's the problem. It's a double-edged sword. You've got to have functional clotting factors, but when they become too activated, they block our arteries.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, the question is LDL always innocent of causing heart disease? And the answer is, well, it kind of depends. So this is a very important slide in which you go into a little bit of detail about LDL. The thing to realize is that when we have cholesterol, which is packaged by our liver, the liver takes that cholesterol and packages it in a protein coat, which is called VLDL. And under normal conditions, for a healthy person with low triglycerides, high HDL, it will package that LDL in what can be called large buoyant LDL. And there is no association of large buoyant LDL to heart disease. So this tells us that fundamentally, LDL is healthy. Now, in a person that is unhealthy, let's say has metabolic syndrome, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high triglycerides, the LDL is packaged differently. It tends to have more triglycerides in it. Its shape is different. Its composition is different. It is then what's called small dense LDL. I think of it also as small damaged LDL. And so the small damaged LDL exists in an unhealthy metabolism. It is part of the problem. The problem is the high blood sugar and everything else that goes along with it. And then when you have damaged LDL, it's just part of this party that's creating havoc. And this is the problem. People still try to associate the LDL with heart disease, and they need to understand that it is only the small dense, the small damaged LDL that is associated with heart disease. But if you've got your blood sugar and your blood pressure low and your weight good, then you don't have much in the way of small dense LDL.
Yes.
And here I've just shown a study, a really nice study, in which you ask the question, people who have high small dense LDL, and that's in red, what do they look like metabolically? And so the people with high small dense LDL have extremely high triglycerides. That's where they're over 200 in the red. And on the right, the people who have high small dense LDL, 75% of them are diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, which means they've got the high triglycerides, the high weight, the blood sugar. But if you've got the low small dense LDL, and that's in blue, triglyceride levels are great, and they're very much less likely to be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. And that's what's so important. And I really like what you emphasize, Ken, is the good diet, the good lifestyle. If you've got your weight down and you're exercising and you're cutting your carbs, you're cutting your blood pressure, your blood sugar, well, then you're going to have a healthy metabolism along with a healthy form of LDL.
Exactly right. And I don't think we can emphasize that enough. The vast majority of doctors out there currently, for some reason, the metabolic syndrome is just either not on the radar, or they think it's genetic. There's nothing you can do about that. You just have that, as if it's part of your definition. They don't even stop to consider, is this something that this patient has acquired because of their diet and lifestyle? It's like they don't consider that, or they suspect that the patient is a lazy glutton, is just going to lay on the couch and eat donuts and is never going to change anything. And I think that's absolutely false. I think if people know that there's hope and know there is a way to have normal metabolic health again, they'll actively pursue that. If you give them an easy map, this is where you want to be, this is where you're at now, this is how to get there. And if the advice you give them about that is actually implementable and usable and actually gives results, I find that people are eager to follow that plan and to adopt a proper human diet. And then they become eager to get their labs rechecked every 3 months or every 6 months so that they can see what they've done to their A1C, what they've done to their fasting insulin, what they've done to their triglycerides. Whereas in the past, when they were getting improper nutrition advice, they dreaded having their labs checked because they just knew it was going to be worse.
Now, unlike you, almost all physicians, when you got a patient with metabolic syndrome, the response will be medication. And so we're looking at drugs that will raise HDL, drugs that will lower triglycerides, drugs that will enable people to lose weight, drugs to basically treat every aspect of metabolic syndrome. And on top of that, doctors so often will recommend a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet. And they're just so out of touch with the science. Now, you go to the American Heart Association website, you're not going to see any of this information. You're not going to see recommendations for the low-carb diet. You're not going to see the difference between small, dense, and large point LDL. You're just going to see LDL-C, which is demonized. And that's just the total cholesterol you see in all the LDL. So you're not getting the best information. Not only that, you're getting very biased information from the American Heart Association. You're not seeing that the low-carb diet is ideal as the treatment for metabolic syndrome.
Absolutely. And there are many theories as to why the American College of Cardiology and the AHA are so adamant at sticking to the guns on LDL. We won't get into conspiracies today, but suffice it to say that Dr. Diamond is absolutely correct. That is what they talk about. That is what they promote, regardless of the science that you're seeing right now in front of your eyes.
Well, we don't need to talk about it as a conspiracy. It's simple profit. It's very simple. Corn oil is heart healthy. Why? Because it lowers your cholesterol. Numerous herbs, garlic is sold. What do? They lower your cholesterol. Becoming a vegetarian is promoted. Why? The only good thing about being a vegetarian, it lowers your cholesterol. And of course, there's more and more medication that's generated over $1 trillion in revenue. Why? To lower cholesterol, with almost negligible benefits of any of those. And in fact, corn oil definitely not only doesn't lower your risk of heart disease, it can increase your risk of heart disease. So I don't think of it as a conspiracy. I think of it as a very simple business model. You can target LDL, you can lower it many different ways, and you can make a lot of money by lowering LDL. You don't make any money by recommending people don't eat carbs.
Exactly. And to just expound on what Dr. Diamond just said, in nutrition science, you very seldom will see a randomized control trial in human beings in human nutrition. But the question of replacing animal fats, aka saturated fat, with corn oil, this has actually been studied in 3 separate randomized control trials in human beings that didn't go on for a few days or a few weeks or a few months. These were in-house studies that I think in one case it was a 7-year-long study. One was 3 years long, one was 5 years long. Most doctors have never heard of these studies where they took people who were in institutions and they just substituted all of the animal fat with corn oil. And in all 3 studies, randomized control study, one of them was blinded, one of them was double blinded. In human beings, long-term studies, all 3 studies found that human beings die sooner on the corn oil. They have a higher risk of cancer on the corn oil. One of the studies found they actually have a higher rate of heart events, heart attacks on the corn oil. 2 of these studies were suppressed. One wasn't published for decades. One was hidden in the researcher's attic or basement and was found by his son decades after the study was completed, because they firmly believed that replacing animal saturated fat with corn oil was very protective and very healthy. And when they got the results back and crunched the numbers, they're like, oh my God, I can't publish this. I'll lose my tenure. I'll be laughed out of the business. And so they just suppressed the studies. This is not debatable. This is proven. I actually made a YouTube video about this a year or two ago about these 3 studies. But the average doctor has never heard of these randomized controlled trials where animal fat was replaced with corn oil and the patients uniformly did worse.
I love that you're so aware of the literature, Ken. And we're talking about studies that were done 50 years ago. And the reason why they haven't been repeated is, frankly, obviously the corn oil industry doesn't want to conduct any more of these studies, since people are dying at a higher rate when they're having corn oil. By the way, in one of the studies, people were basically told not to change their diet. These are people at high risk of having a heart attack. Go home, don't change your diet, and they fully expected them to die of heart disease. Whereas the people that were told to have the corn oil, these are the ones that died or had a heart attack at a much higher rate than the people who said, don't bother to change your diet.
Exactly.
So, yeah, these are studies done decades ago that clearly indicate that corn oil is not heart healthy, and yet it continues to have the heart healthy logo, because it is true. You consume corn oil, you lower your cholesterol, but as John Abramson said, dying with lower cholesterol is not a successful outcome.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.